I'm going to hand over to one of our new partners, Tim Gocher. Tim's a new partner to TBN, really excited about him joining. And I'm not going to steal some of his thunder, but he's focused on working in Nepal. And I hope you'll be inspired by what you hear. There's a lot of inspiring individuals who are going to actually talk about what it looks like on the ground. And I'll invite Tim to come up.
Thanks, Joe. Hey, thanks. Good job. First, tell me what to click. Next. There you go. Right. Okay, everybody hear me? Hi. Well, I'm here to talk about Nepal, a fascinating and very beautiful country. I guess first I should ask, as Jim O'Neill did this morning, he didn't get a big response to his South Korea or Turkey, but is anybody from Nepal? That would have surprised me. Has anyone been to Nepal? This normally happens. All right. And I just spoke to a gentleman who spent the last 11 years living in Nepal, and I'm about to move there, so I'll be speaking to you later to get some tips. I'm actually going to announce today, for the first time publicly, the completion of our fundraising for the first commercial impact fund for Nepal. It's the first close. We have been at this for 2 years. We started fundraising in 2012. And so I'm going to talk today a little bit about that fund, particularly how commercial or quasi-commercial capital can particularly alleviate poverty and what are some of the challenges around operating in these very challenging markets. But before I do, I wanted to give you a little bit of history about why on earth this man here has spent so much time in Nepal. Why did this happen? What's the background to this? And it started when I went to the Himalayas, to Nepal in 2003, with the objective of really getting as far away from my life as I possibly could. Nepal and the Himalayas seemed pretty remote, and so that's where I ended up. I was trekking through the northern region on the Tibet border on my own, just with a tour guide, and it was monsoon time. That was the only time I could go. And I was being deluged and eaten by leeches, and the paths were washed away, and my tour guide said, listen, we could go and shelter in my village. I'm from, a couple of mountains over. If we can make it over there, at least we can stay dry. So I took him up on that. He said, I'm really sorry, it's probably a really boring place. It's a tiny village, there's no electricity, there's no phones, there's nothing to do. I said, it's okay, at least we'll be dry. So there I was, and after 2 days the rains cleared and he wanted me to come, and I wouldn't leave. And 2 weeks later I'm still in this village, absolutely astounded by the people that I met, astounded by their passion, their compassion, the peaceful nature with which they live with the things that we don't have. And in the village I was staying in, I met a girl. Her name is Dolma, and that's a common Tibetan name. And her family was particularly good to me, asking for nothing in response, as Tibetans very rarely do. And I decided that I wanted to send her to school, because there was no school in this village. And so I set up the Dolma Development Fund, instead of just sending the money myself, so other people could donate. And then I'm thinking, well, how on earth could people... How can I get people? I've never done charity before. I'm a businessman. I don't know how to do this. So what we did is we set up a project called Dolma Ecotourism, which is a non-profit ecotourism project, which hopefully allows people to experience the kind of immersive inclusion that I felt in these cultures. Very different to the trekking through the mountains, taking a photograph of villages and moving on. This is community tourism. This is the people's business. And so we set that up. It's been very successful, and hundreds of people have come through the mountains. And because it's non-profit, any of the profits, of course, go back into the charity, the Dolma Development Fund, and that sponsors children. We now have 70 scholarships running for the poorest children, taking them from the mountain villages right through to university or vocational training if they can make it that far. And we found that education is by far and away the most impactful of the interventions that we can do on a long-term poverty alleviation basis. Now, before I go into some rather dry numbers on economics, I thought I would introduce you to some of the people, because they, rather than the economic figures, are what inspired me and many people to work in the country. These are all my friends, I'm proud to say, and they're from that very district along the Tibetan border. And I've had quite a journey in those years. I experienced life in village. I think one of the most striking things to me was the sustainability of life in the traditional village. Sustainability is kind of a cool word these days. You know, we want to be carbon neutral. Of course, these people have been living within the limits of their resources, their forests, for thousands of years in exactly the same way. I was particularly inspired by that. I love the way that villagers, these two gentlemen here, Kokta and Torchi, they are mentally disabled, but people there don't shove disabled people in a home. They find out what good they can do. So, for example, Dorji has an affliction which sees him howl frequently. He howls. And so the villagers thought, what can he do? So they've built him a little shed in the cow fields, and at night they put him there, and he howls, and he keeps the wild cats and the foxes and everything from the mountains away. This is a perfect example of utility. Everybody has a use in this society, and it's beautiful. I also met my wife, who is Nepali, and I must say is not featured in these photos. But I met my wife, and just in case you were wondering who that Burke is over there, that's me, in Tibetan dress after a few too many of the local moonshines. Right, so anyway, I'm not here to talk about the charity. I'm still the chairman of the charity. That still goes strong. I'm here to talk about the first commercial impact investment fund, indeed, the first private equity fund of any kind dedicated to the country. In 2012, I was struck by three things which made me think that such a fund may be possible. The first was the rise of social venture capital funds, impact funds throughout the world. Especially I was focused on South Asia. So, obviously there's lots. The industry has grown enormously in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. As you look on the map, there's one country missing that has no such fund, and that is Nepal. And I said again, going even further, Nepal doesn't have even a private equity fund of any denomination. And I wondered why that is, so I started looking into it. The second trend was the progress which Nepal has had. Now, you may have heard of the terrible problems of the murdering of the royal family, the Maoist insurgency, which finished in 2006. Now, by 2012, that peace process was almost complete. There's obviously been a lot of political bickering, but we've had a very successful election last year with 70% voter turnout, and we've now seen those Maoist rebels take government, lead a government, and now form an opposition government. So we're seeing a lot more political stability in Nepal. And the third is the economics of the country. And this decided that my skill set in business and investment might, after all, be of use to Nepal. I often curse myself for not being a teacher or a doctor. It might actually be useful. But I thought actually an investment intervention to drive jobs and alleviate poverty might just work. And let me paint that third pillar of the stool, which is the economic story. First of all, you can see from these figures, Nepal is, by quite a long way, the poorest country in South Asia. This doesn't include Sri Lanka. It is, except for Sri Lanka, the smallest country. A lot of people think Nepal is like Bhutan, sort of 1 million people. Actually, it's the size of Malaysia from a population perspective. It has enormous natural resources. It's blessed with 40% of South Asia's water source, which brings hydro potential through the fast-flowing rivers. It's the most rural, the least urbanized, and the fastest urbanizing country in South Asia. And if you look at the remittance statistic, this is what really made me sit up and look. The highest percentage of GDP remittances by a long way in the region. Now, this is what caught my eye. It's a factor of the lack of ability of the nation to generate jobs for its own people. That is why so many Nepalis are going abroad. Some of you may have seen in The Guardian recently the expose of the treatment of Nepali migrant workers in Qatar, how 185 at least died last year. This is a common problem. But the flip side of that problem is that it brings remittances. Let me just say that a recent statistic, of 400,000 people that enter the job market in Nepal each year, 350,000 leave to work abroad. That is how chronic the shortage of employment locally is, and that's what's driven this mass migration of people. But it has created a benefit. It's created a benefit in that children of the poorer families, the rural families, those without education, are the ones sent abroad to be labourers. 63% of that remittance inflow is going to the rural poor. And that is for the first time giving spending power to the rural poor to buy what people with disposable income for the first time spend on. That is clean energy, or energy, power. It is healthcare, education, clean water, perhaps a bank account, these kind of things. And so what I realize is that the spending power, the growth markets in Nepal are exactly aligned with the human index industries, the impact investment, typical industries. And really what we had to do, many countries in southern Europe anyway would welcome a over-demand problem. What Nepal has is plenty of demand coming from the poorer people, but without the supply, without the growth capital, without the technology and expertise that comes with that growth capital. And so what's happened? Well, demand has increased, revenue in companies has increased across the board, agricultural, pharmaceutical, people are buying these products. What's happening at the same time? Imports from India are shooting up at almost exactly the same rate. What that tells us is that the opportunity of this demand to be spent and processed and supplied in Nepal, creating the jobs, is not happening. The wealth is simply flowing through to India. The traders in Nepal are getting bigger, but the value adders, the producers are not. And so that, to me, is a market-driven opportunity to alleviate poverty through private sector capital. And so we created the Dolma Impact Fund, and this takes us to 2012 when I stood at the Nepali embassy and launched the fundraising. A lot of people thought I was crazy. I thought I was crazy. My wife certainly thought I was crazy, and she's Nepali. But we're there. You'll notice here, so we still, of course, run the charity. I've noticed a few people I'm talking to today have this sort of parallel charity and private sector vehicle. And we followed very much the same approach. We believe that, in fact, I believe that this is really a spectrum. In Nepal, which is quite saturated with NGOs, you often have this debate of aid versus trade. The NGO people will think the capitalists are the evil ones, and the capitalists think the NGOs are spending everybody's taxpayers' money, etc., etc. And I don't see that at all. I see poverty alleviation as a spectrum of interventions from the market. A business person in Nepal does not need a grant if he has a successful business. They need an equity investment or a loan in that business. Similarly, a girl in a mountain village, there's no business model to be had if there's no school. They've just got to go to school. Giving is fine. And as I said before, the Dolma Development Fund charity also does these sort of more subsidized impact investment like the ecotourism project. But the Dolma Impact Fund is a purely commercial-focused fund. It is, we're doing our first close at 21 million. We plan to go on with a final close at 40. And realistically, because two of our limited partners have co-investment rights to co-invest as we do deals, we expect to bring around $60 million into the country. That's a small fund, but in Nepali terms, that makes us one of the largest financial institutions, believe it or not, in the country. The partners, limited partners, are FMO, there's the DFIs, FMO from the Netherlands, FinFund from Finland, Austrian Development Bank, as well as a few high net worth individuals. Now, in terms of impact, what are we trying to do? You can measure everything you like, and I know that this is a big issue for many impact fund managers. We're focused on jobs. We're focused on jobs and stimulating more capital into the country. The jobs for the obvious reasons that I've said. There's a very good market solution to the jobs crisis in Nepal, and we believe, based upon other metrics, mainly developed by Avishkar in India, that we could create about 17,000 jobs. The other is FDI stimulus. Simply by being in existence, markets and capitalists are fickle at the moment. 5 years ago, India was flavour of the month. Now returns on private equity are looking particularly difficult in India. There's been a few policy mistakes. And so, what we hope to do is to prove that Nepal can process institutional, responsible capital investments from abroad, repatriate them. And I think once that track record starts to build up, one would expect, given Nepal's natural assets, for investment to flood in. So, just like a previous speaker, we were backed by DFID to help take some of that risk, to help create what they call a capital bridgehead into the country. And specifically, some of the things we work on with DFID are to share our knowledge from being the first fund. There's some complicated ways you need to structure things and all of the terms for the investors that reduce some of the risk of those investors. And we share all of those with DFID, who shares it with the broader market to all potential investors into the country. We particularly work on a few bits of regulatory advocacy. So, one of the benefits you can have in a country which is very willing for this capital, I must say, from a regulatory perspective, is that you can work. If this was India, I couldn't get my arms around the nation to make regulatory change. However, we've been very successful with the central bank and the Department of Industry in removing things which they didn't know were a blockage to foreign investment, but in fact they were. And by coming in as somebody with capital, as opposed to the World Bank writing a vast policy report for the Minister of Finance, we come in with very specific things. We need the following change to your stock market regulations. We need the following change to the FDI. And very often they've done that and they've facilitated. To give you an idea of the kind of support that we have on the regulatory side, the governor of the central bank himself has met every single investor who has come on due diligence trips to Nepal. Now that, for me, for a $40 million fund to have the central bank, I don't think Mr. Carney would do the same for any British funds. But it really shows the strong sort of support at the top level of the regulators. So I think this knowledge transfer of us, coming into the market, not just for the impact and the equity and the growth and the jobs, etc., but in terms of governance, in terms of the knowledge transfer from what we bring, mandated by European sovereign funds, the compliance that we have to comply with, all hopefully gets fed into companies. I wanted to bring up one point about governance and corruption particularly, because many nations that a lot of us deal in suffer from that. I wrote in a London Business School blog last year about sort of corruption being this cancer that when it reaches critical mass, it actually very much affects market dynamics. And what it does is people begin to compete on how much money they can save, how much tax they can dodge, how much faster or cheaper they can get a government license for something. This is a kind of a very negative cycle. What I would love to see out of this, and this is quite utopian, I must say, but I'd love to drop a few champions of industries in Nepal who compete through investment, strategy, technology, management skill, and move the sort of beacon of the magnet of competition to a more positive level. Instead of how much can I save, how much tax can I dodge, it's, my goodness, I need some of this type of capital or this type of growth or this type of technology. So this creates very much a virtuous cycle. Unless we can do that, I don't believe that we can eradicate poverty. I don't believe that we can eradicate corruption and therefore poverty. I think it's a vicious cycle where people don't pay their taxes, therefore countries become more dependent on foreign aid, and this continual aid dependency increases. So this is a sort of long-term goal, but the issue of corruption is very, very important, and I think treating businessmen as opposed to a moral judgment, but more with a pragmatic working plan of how to get themselves out of the necessity in some cases to perform some of these activities is very important. I'll just finish by talking a little bit about, how am I doing for time? Right. A little about the industries, I've already mentioned them. Just to highlight our top four at the moment. So basically we will start to invest this year. Hydro is very important, and one of our top potential pipeline investments is a hydro developer. And the obvious impact on that is, of course, to create power. Actually, the job creation from hydro is directly fairly small. To run a hydro plant doesn't take a lot of people. But, of course, it lights the villages around it. And I would say Nepal, Kathmandu has 16 hours of power cuts at this time of year per day. So you can see the kind of demand that we have on that power. Agriculture is rising across the board as people have more money, they eat better, they want their livestock to be fed better. And we have a great company which is a livestock feed company. They make very nutritious quality pellets. And we believe that's a great business, particularly because in Nepal you have a situation where it's hard to source your supply chain and guarantee quality, either in delivery, time, or product. And so it's also boosting these imports from India. But what a lot of these companies are doing are backwards integrating it into the local supply chain. So in this case, the pellet feed company, its inputs come from agricultural produce, from corn, etc. They're now backwards integrating into the Nepal agricultural community, helping increase their quality, giving them silos to store the grain so that they can trade at the right time at the right price. And the impact, therefore, is way beyond the jobs created by this particular investment, but on the entire agricultural ecosystem. Education, healthcare is obvious, particularly a pharmaceutical company that we love, which creates incredibly cheap drugs for the poorest Nepalis, of the standard drugs, statins, high blood pressure, etc. So, we've had a lot of experiences and challenges so far. The fund is just beginning, with the 10-year fund kicking off now. I'm just going to finish and take some questions by... Oh, I forgot about this one. So our board of directors continue on. Actually, it does include David Grigson. They're both founding directors, who is the Trinity Mirror chairman, Mirror newspaper group, and was the CFO of Reuters, as well as Rameshwar Prasad Kanal, who was the finance secretary of Nepal, famous for standing down on an anti-corruption basis. He's an extremely strong anti-corruption campaigner, which, of course, is a big part of what we do. But to come back to what this is all about, is about the people of Nepal. Now, that was Dolma when I first met her in 2003, or at least when she was first at school. And that was Dolma towards the end of last year, now a college student studying dental nursing, which is a very good vocational qualification, which will see her come back and work in her community with a steady salary, which is multiples of what her illiterate parents could ever earn. This is why we do it, not for the economic statistics. It's for the impact on poverty, whether that's charity or whether that's as a fund manager. But I thank you very much for listening, and I'd be very happy to take any questions.
Just a couple quick ones. Peter?
Good morning, Tim. Thank you. I had the pleasure of being at your presentation at the Nepal Embassy, so well done. Congratulations on getting your money. I'm also involved in a project in Lagos looking at the provision of private education to 1.4 million children, which is 70% of the educational population in that state. So I'm particularly interested in your pipeline of educational impact investment opportunities, and if you can give us some flavour for that and what form it might take, that would be very helpful. Sure.
Well, the pipeline is really two. The easiest to explain is a technology. It's a content, so it's the Nepali curriculum throughout the years, but it's based on animated and video technology. And this is targeted at rural schools, Kathmandu schools as well, but particularly rural schools, which I don't know the situation exactly where you're planning to invest, but in Nepal you have a very diverse, obviously you have the Himalayas, so you have this problem of critical mass. If you're lucky enough to have a school in a village, you probably don't have enough students to warrant enough teachers, and certainly not enough money to have a teacher per year. So you might have a teacher teaching 3 or 4 or even 10 different years in an extreme case. And so they're never going to know the curricula that they're teaching. And so this excellent piece of software, which is already sold very well in Kathmandu, is now rolling out to these regions. And we believe that could have a great impact. In the schooling itself, as a charity, we've made investments in schools, and we're looking for what we would call rural hub schools to invest in. What I mean by rural hubs is that one of the problems, obviously there are lots of schools in Kathmandu, so if you had enough money, you could take all the kids out of the villages, send them to schools in Kathmandu, they get a great education, but of course you break with the culture, which is so beautiful, which is one of the reasons I love the place. And so what we're doing is investing in rural hub schools. That may be the provincial district town capital. In one case, there's a school that's a town of 3,000 people, but the surrounding areas probably have about 10,000 people in the villages, which we can draw on. That is close enough geographically for them to get home, if not at weekends, certainly every holiday, for the parents to frequently come to the school, to start to teach cultural classes. So as well as the academic curriculum, they're also learning, in this case, they're Tibetan people learning a Nepali curriculum. So we try to keep the language and the dance and the culture going. And so in this way, we've managed to mitigate some of that sort of cultural risk of just throwing kids into education, and that's proven very successful. So that's basically the two models. I'm very keen to think about net impact. There is no such thing that I've experienced in charity anyway, where an intervention is 100% good. Even things that we as Westerners think are absolutely good, healthcare. Well, let's have healthcare in a village. Well, then the shaman's out of business. That's probably worth it, but let's help the shaman. In education, it's certainly the case. You take people out of their communities, those skills that they grow up with. So how can you mitigate that? So I often think about net impact. I came in green to this whole thing, thinking education's always good, in every case. It is, but I think models which help to mitigate the cultural loss is very important. Thank you.
One last one, Andrew.
Okay, Tim, I'm going to ask a miserable investor's question.
Please.
Because they ask the questions of me, which is when you're asking people for money, they say, to invest, they say, well, tell me about your team, tell me about their experience of investment, have they done it before, have they made money? So let me put those questions to you, if I may, please.
Thank you, as the proxy investor in the room. Well, the team has been a fascinating experience. I am the only non-Nepali person in the investment team. So I act also as the CEO of the Dolma Impact Fund. And the other team, there's only 6 of us at the moment. It'll grow maybe to 8 to 10. The first wave of hiring was from abroad, but to find NRNs, non-resident Nepalis, who had got their degrees and experience in this case, America and Britain, and bring them back. So that was the first. At least you then had the local language. They probably hadn't worked in Nepal. They've usually left to do either their bachelor's or their master's, but at least they're Nepali. They can speak the language, and they've got international best practice and track records for investors, etc. Then the trick was that wasn't enough. We then needed to hire locally. So we hired a couple of local people, particularly our investment director, who was one of the biggest hydro financiers on the debt side. Now, the problem in a market which has never had a private equity fund is you don't have anyone that knows anything about private equity. So you've got this blend of people which are from the debt side, from the operating side of Nepali businesses, who have been through it. He's a chartered accountant. He knows all the tricks that they play on the books. And he's a banker of hydro, which is our important sector. So, in this way, we've blended the team. There's me, there's the NRNs, and there's the locals, and now we're sort of experiencing how that all blends together. But that's how we've put together the track record. This is specifically a market-focused fund, so we are targeting market rates of return. Targeting what we achieve is a different thing. I hope not. But this is very important because it's only if we can prove that Nepal can generate market-based returns based upon its risk will it encourage future capital. Another subsidized fund would not do that.
Thank you.